Next, we'll have Joshua Rust from Stetson University. He's a professor of philosophy at Stetson. He works on social ontology, experimental philosophy, philosophy of biology. He's going to tell us a little bit about what he thinks is required for minimal agency.
Yeah, as Saeed just mentioned, I'm principally mainly a social ontologist, but I've been thinking about agency for a long time in the context of social ontology, and I'm very grateful to Anna Strasser, who's in attendance today, for inviting me to extend those thoughts into the sphere of cognitive science. But my roots in social ontology are going to be very visible today. Probably, 2/3 of this presentation is going to be talking about agency in the social sphere. But then what I'm going to do is use the conclusions I reach there to try to make some claims about whether or not generative AI systems could qualify as minimal agents. So the title of the talk is Minimal Agency in Living in Artificial Systems. And there's kind of 2 points of contrast there. Distinction between natural and artificial systems or agents on the one hand, and then the distinction between minimal versus full-blown agents, right? So what I have in mind by natural agents, right, include single-celled organisms, plants, persons are all natural agents or organic systems. And I take it for granted that natural agents can be placed on something like a spectrum, although maybe there's multiple dimensions of the spectrum between minimal agents, such as single-celled organisms on the one hand, and full-blown agents, such as ourselves, full-blown intentional agents, such as ourselves on the other, and then plants and elephants and these kinds of things fall somewhere in between. When it comes to the distinction between natural agents and artificial agents, I have in mind 2 candidates for artificial agency. On the left-hand side, we have a representation of an institution, and on the right-hand side, we have a representation of a generative artificial system. I'll just use LLMs, but just understand that LLMs is going to be a stand-in for a whole class of possible candidates for agency. Both of these are artificial agents. They're both created by us. And so it occurs to me that if we're going to talk about whether or not some institutions would qualify as agents, minimal agents or full-blown agents, then maybe those same criteria could then be applied to large language models and generative AI systems. Let's begin by thinking about what agency looks like on the level of institutions or organizations. So a couple years ago, there was a paper published called Corporate Insecthood, which is a great name for a paper. And these researchers asked 800 mechanical participants or respondents to list, I think there's some like 60 odd categories on a scale of adult, which is 100, and rock, which is 0, from non-agency to agency. And this was the result of these rankings, right? So this is just drawing from people's intuitions. Obviously, a person would qualify as a full person. People also cast infants as full persons. And then you can see that there's this kind of range. And it seems to me that when we think about personhood and presumably agency, we don't think of personhood or agency in binary terms, but we think about it in terms of degrees. I mean, there's some really funny results in this survey. I'm not sure. So if you look at 50, why an elephant and a deceased man are deemed by the respondents as having the same degree of agency. And even like maybe going down, a computer, I guess, right, has more agency than a rock. I'm not sure about this stuff. But there it is, a microbe at 8.5 is deemed an agent. And probably, this is probably where I would put it, right? It has a little bit less agency or a little bit less personhood than a tree or an ant or a fish or other multicellular organisms. The same researchers went and asked, on the same scale of personhood, where would you locate these various organizations or institutions? And again, like really kind of fascinating results here. Doctors Without Borders apparently has more agency than a cat does, and Exxon has about the same agency or personhood as a computer does. It seems to me that people are attributing agency as a function of sort of the moral goodness or badness of the organization. That's the best I could do. There might even be a sort of Kantian thought here. But again, what I want us to take away from this is that I think ordinarily people are thinking about personhood or agency in terms of degrees, and that they're relatively comfortable attributing degrees of agency to institutions or organizations. And so this raises the question, right? Well, had the researchers asked, where does something like ChatGPT, where would people locate that on the scale of personhood? They did ask about robots, but the category of robots strikes me as too underspecified for that, attribution to tell us much. Okay, so here's the plan for today's presentation. First, I'm going to motivate an inquiry into minimal agency, especially on the institutional level. I'm going to give them two different accounts of minimal agency, what I call the inactivist-Jonesian account on the one hand, and I'm going to contrast the inactivist-Jonesian account with the alternative precedential account. The precedential account I develop in a couple of different papers. And then I'm going to apply the precedential account of generic or minimal agency to the institutional sphere, and then finally apply that account of minimal agency, the precedential account of minimal agency, to large language models. All right. So let me just begin by motivating the search for minimal agency. Again, this is mainly directed at social ontologists, but I have a little bit to say about how it might apply to large language models. So Kirk Ludwig, he's a skeptic about genuine agency at the institutional level. An institution could not constitute in any ordinary sense a thinking thing. Thus, talk of corporate agency is merely a convenience of language. And one of Ludwig's primary arguments for his deflationist view is that, look, in order to qualify as a full-blown intentional agent, you need to carry, and he's following Davidson here, a holistic set of propositional attitudes as a kind of background against which any one of your statements might gain traction. And he's just like, the institutions, right, they just don't have that holistic set of propositional attitudes, so they can't qualify as intentional agents. In a response, Michael Bradman said, look, yeah, that's true, but you're probably thinking about agents as fully blown intentional agents. And there's other kinds of agents, what he calls a generic agent, like, for example, a cat or a microbe or something like that, which would qualify as an agent, but nevertheless, right, probably does not carry that holistic set of propositional attitudes, right? So if we broaden our conception of agency, it might be that Ludwig's premise is exactly right. Institutions can't carry a holistic set of propositional attitudes, but it doesn't thereby follow that the institutions aren't agents, because they might represent a more minimal or more generic conception of agency. And Bradman kind of gives a gesture in this direction, and then I see my work is in some sense exploring Bradman's suggestion. Okay, how might this apply to the case of generative AI agents? So yesterday, Eric Schwitzgebel, and I just realized I messed up your name, Eric, sorry about that, argued that genuinely conscious AI agents shouldn't be built with the capacity for servitude. And that seems exactly right. But again, kind of like Ludwig, I think Eric must be thinking about these AI systems as more or less fully blown intentional agents. And if we introduce the possibility that some AI systems might count as minimal agents, more akin to like a microbe or something like that, then that at least raises the question whether the recommendation holds for AI systems that merely satisfy conditions of minimal agency. The distinction between full-blown and minimal agents might make a difference to what kind of rights we could attribute to them. So that's just to motivate this. A sociologist, William Scott, makes a distinction between rational organizations and natural organizations. Rational organizations are organizations that are principally just tools, right? They're social structures that are useful to us, that allow us to do things that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do, on Scott's reading, right? So they're collectivities oriented towards the pursuit of relatively specific goals, and tend to exhibit a relatively highly formalized social structure. But then Scott, he's a structural functionalist, right? Or at least he's inspired by structural functionalists, says, yeah, while a lot of institutions are rational organizations, tool-like in this way, there's a subclass of organizations or institutions which qualify as natural organizations. And these kind of have an organismic quality to them, right? These natural organizations are collectivities whose participants recognize the value of perpetuating the organization itself as an important resource. And they also tend to have more of an informal structure, right? So there's kind of, right, a characteristic of a natural organization on Scott's view is that there's a kind of self-persistence goal, right? Which you don't get in more tool-like organizations, right? A hammer is only good insofar as it helps us drive nails. There's no sense in which a hammer also has, some sort of intrinsic goal to perpetuate itself. So a hallmark on Scott's view of natural, more organismic organizations is this self-persistence goal. Now, when you go back to social ontologists, most social ontologists agree that social institutions tend to be rational systems, right? So John Searle says a common element that runs through all or nearly all institutions is that they're enabling structures that increase human power in many different ways. Institutions are useful tools or instruments that help us solve cooperation and coordination problems. So when social ontologists are thinking about organizations, they tend to think about it in what Scott calls rational terms, as tools. But Philip Selznick, who's a sociologist and a structural functionalist, says, yeah, look, it's true. right? Most organizations are comparable to, quote, an expendable tool, a rational instrument to do a job. But he also suggests that some institutions are better conceived as, quote, an adaptive organism deemed to have basic needs essentially related to self-maintenance. For the subset of organizations, it would seem that they would qualify as something more akin to an agent or organism. And note again here that appeal to self-maintenance, right? That a marker, according to the structural functionalist, being a natural organization or sort of pseudo a minimal agent, is that some sort of self-persistence goal. And I keep bringing that up because I'm going to interrogate it. But let's push this a little further. So Sheldon Messenger is another structural functionalist. And again, he shares this view that there's a subset of organizations that are more organismic and so oriented towards a self-persistence goal. And he has this fascinating, very short paper on the Townsend organization. So the Townsend organization is a political interest group started in the 1920s. And their goal was to advocate for what became US Social Security, so pensions for the elderly. And this organization had millions of people in it. And then the worst thing that could happen to an organization happened. It succeeded. Right? In 1936, US Social Security was passed, which more or less mirrored the plan that was proposed by the Townsend organization. And so Sheldon Messenger asked, well, what happened to the Townsend organization after it succeeded at doing what its mission was to do? And he documents the way in which the Townsend organization sort of over the course of a decade veered from a political interest group to kind of a recreational club and sales organization. This would almost be as if like the Girl Scouts, right? For whatever reason, their mission, I don't know, maybe all the girls that were going to the Girl Scouts went to the Boy Scouts. Their mission failed, and then they pivoted to kind of like cookie company, right? Like the same thing happened for the Townsend organization. And from Messenger's point of view, he's like, see, right? The Townsend organization isn't just a useful tool. It has these attributes of minimal agency. So he concludes that the Townsend organization was merely oriented to the intrinsically purposive goal of, quote, maintaining the organization structure as such, even at the loss of the organization's central mission. Now, I don't find Messenger's argument that convincing, and here's where I'm going to begin to attack this conception of minimal agency is built around a self-persistence goal. You know who the persistence of the organization is also good for, in addition to the organization itself, is key stakeholders, right? That is, we can explain why the Townsend organization made the pivot it does without having to posit anything like some sort of intrinsic system-level persistence goal. A little bit more on this idea of a minimal agent as characterized by a survival goal. Okay, it's not just Selznick who makes this claim that natural organization is an adaptive organism, but this intuition finds formal expression in what might be called the Jonesian school of enactivist thought. Okay, and Hans Jonas here is drawing from Weber and Varela. They write this very famous paper within the enactivist literature, 2002, and draw from Hans Jonas. And again, implicit in all of these criteria is something like an appeal to a self-persistence goal, right? So Hans Jonas perhaps has the most extravagant formulation of this hallmark of natural agency. The fundamental point of departure is that life says yes to itself, and wishing itself to continue, it declares itself as a value, unquote. Francisco Varela, the autopoetic closure of self-production is already and inevitably a self-affirmation that shows the organism is involved in the fundamental purpose of maintaining its identity. And then this idea gets amplified by Evan Thompson and DiPaolo. Okay, I don't think that an appeal to a self-persistence goal is an adequate conception of minimal agency, right? Despite what the structural functionalists think, and despite what this school of enactivist thinkers think. I'm worried about a couple of things, right? First of all, a self-persistence goal is extremely cognitively demanding, right? So if a unicell, like E. coli, is a candidate for a minimal agent, right, for it to have something like an intrinsic self-persistence goal that is not imposed on it from an external observer, first of all, it would seem to have some sort of self-consciousness and have to recognize itself as a self that could die. And it would also have to have the capacity for some sort of future-oriented instrumental model-based instrumental rationality, right? So that it has the goal of self-persistence, and then it would take steps in order to maintain its existence. And that just seems like an extraordinary thing for a single-celled organism to be able to do. Okay, no doubt higher animals, multicellular organisms do it, probably elephants do it. They have maybe the requisite self-consciousness and this capacity to orient itself to self-persistence, but I'm just not sure that a single cell agent has this, right? And this has been brought up within the inactivist literature. So Barrett says, on what grounds can we claim that the most primitive forms of life really affirm themselves simply by continuing to persist? What explanatory traction do we gain by attributing normative and experiential terms like self-interest and concern to processes of self-maintenance? But I think a simpler formulation, I like Aaron Simmons. He's working within animal welfare literature. He asks, when we witness animals' self-protective behavior in the face of threats to their lives, is it really their continued existence that they're desiring and thinking about protecting, or is it only perhaps the threat of pain that concerns them? So what's an alternative account of minimal agency that doesn't appeal to the self-persistence goal, which strikes me as too cognitively demanding? And I think there's a variety of articulations of the thing that I'm getting at, right? So psychologists make a distinction between model-based learners and model-free learners. Model-based learners recruit representations of outcome contingencies and values that necessarily inform goal-directed behavior. Sure, like if you have a self-persistence goal, then you might have a model for what kind of behaviors will help better realize your goal of self-persistence. But again, I'm not sure single-celled organisms are model-based learners. Instead, they seem to be model-free learners, which promotes the execution of well-honed behavioral routines without forethought or attention. I think a similar distinction is implicit in Dennett's distinction between Popperian creatures and Skinnerian creatures. Skinnerian creatures employ a kind of blind generate and test approach to competence building. They more or less randomly generate new behaviors. This is Dennett's. And again, the distinction between the inactivist Jonesian account, right, which is more goal-directed. But there's some inactivists who also promote what they call a sensory motor account, which is, right, more Skinnerian, more model-free. So here are Hutto and Min, right, that sensory motor agents engage in mentality constituting interactions that are grounded in, shaped by and explained by nothing more or other than the history of an organism's previous interactions, right? So that generate backwards looking rather than forward looking generate and test approach, which over sufficient number of iterations, right, can lead to survival promoting behavior. So here's the proposed precedential account in contrast to the Jonesian account. There's two components here. First of all, the system must have the capacity to be for primordial stochasticity. So organisms necessarily engage in quasi-random exploratory behavior because living systems are semi-ordered systems that exist near the edge of chaos. Okay, so there's something, right, for this generate and test model-free approach, we have to have the capacity to just try almost randomly new things. But that has to be combined with the capacity for precedential or backwards-looking normativity, right? So with repetition, these quasi-random behaviors increasingly carry the weight of precedent for an agent by serving as a standard that guides behavior when a similar situation is re-encountered. Okay, so what begins as random, right, ends up taking on a sort of normative tone for the agent itself. And then, of course, these minimal agents are also subject to natural selection. These agents are going to try a bunch of things, and then depending on the environment, most of those attempts are going to fail, leading to the death of the organism or the population. But some of those initially random stochastic behaviors, combined with a tendency to perseverate on those initial random behaviors, are going to survive selection, right? Which explains why, right, E. coli behave, right, so effectively when it comes to promoting their own survival, but it's not because they have a survival goal. It's because they're subject to a process of natural selection. And when it comes to what it is that the single-celled organism, I don't know, understands, maybe that says too much. All they're doing is doing what they did before. Okay, so a couple of illustrations of this. Let me begin with the right. So Novick and Weiner famously observed the genetically identical E. coli. They were given this lactose imitate. E. coli consume lactose, but this is a slight variation on the lactose that they were used to consuming. And these genetically identical E. coli just freaked out, right? They responded in like 6 different ways trying to ingest the lactose. Of course, most of these responses failed and those E. coli died, but one of the responses was effective. Moreover, they found that these responses were stickier or precedential or perseverative, in that the initial response, while random, predicted subsequent responses. And it would predict subsequent responses even when they changed the lactose imitate back to kind of standard lactose, right? That there was a way in which, like a flywheel, the initially random responses had a way of sticking. Even more interestingly, these responses were transmitted to subsequent generations via epigenetic mechanisms, okay? Over the last couple of decades, biologists have become increasingly tuned to the possibility of what they call personality, right? So it's not just E. coli. A number of studies have shown that fruit flies, genetically identical fruit flies, they might have a tendency, some have more of a tendency to explore, some of them have less of a tendency to explore, and then they'll do it. They'll explore or not, depending on what they did the first time when confronted with a novel environment. We also see this in babies. So Thalen and Smith have an exploration of infant perseverative reaching. So around 8 months old, Skinner discovered this. If you put two napkins in front of them, you put a toy under the napkin, they'll reach for the toy, remove the napkin, get the toy. They do this a couple of times just to sort of acclimate the infant to the exercise. But at about 8 months, not before, if the researcher openly puts the toy under the different napkin in front of the baby, the infant will still reach for the original napkin, right? And Skinner thought that this had to do with an infant's imperfect grasp of object permanence. But I think Thalen and Smith effectively argued that no, it's actually the training routine, right? Where they're just getting the baby used to the experiment that actually builds a sort of mini habit that becomes very hard to overcome. The baby knows full well where the toy is, but can't do anything about it. They've ingrained themselves into reaching for the wrong place. So I'm going to this is about a minute long video. This is the best part of my presentation.
You ready? There he is. Very good, Jenna. There he is.
All right, there's the two napkins. The baby knows exactly what's going on.
You holding on tight this time. You holding on tight this time. Oh. There he is.
All right, that's the third time the baby's done that. And right, and now that perseveration, that tendency to reach for the same place is pretty ingrained. The baby saw exactly where that toy's going. Oh, so disappointing.
Oh, there he is. There he is.
Look, there's something that we have in common with E. coli, right? We try things randomly, and the very act of behaving randomly, it tends to engender a kind of habit. And I think this, right, is the hallmark of minimal agency more than any sort of attribution of an intrinsic survival goal for the reasons I talked about before. I just don't think that many minimal agents are cognitively capable of carrying a survival. So what happens when such systems, minimal agents, come to perseverate on initially stochastic behavior? And I'm going to use a word, I'm just making this up, propriety, to capture something that I don't totally understand. I'd like to actually write and think more about this, but this is a couple of gestures in this direction, right? So propriety is the capacity of certain systems, right, to make that which was initially extrinsic their own, right? So that initial behavior, that random behavior, was not their own, right? Not the first time, right? But as the system, the agent uses that initially random behavior, treats it as precedent, then what the agent's essentially doing, this is one way of articulating what I'm trying to get at with propriety, is that they can transform an is into an ought. All of a sudden, what was random carries a sort of normative weight, all right? Here, Peirce has a lot to say about this, right? When he describes the way in which a particular, say, action becomes exemplarized into a general norm. And it may be that that's just what a hallmark, what a basic hallmark of an agent is to take something random, right, and exemplarize it into a general norm. I'm also sort of taken by William Wimsatt's suggestion that agents are systems that can transform the accidental, that would be the initial stochastic behavior, into the essential, right? So in some sense, that norm, right, becomes incorporated into, I don't know, the essence of the agent itself. And I even want to make the stronger claim that only agential systems can do this, right? Can perseverate on initially stochastic behavior, can transform an is into an ought. So solar systems and Bernard cells, right? There's plenty of random fluctuations, but what it can't do is use those, what those systems can't do is use those random fluctuations as the basis for a norm of behavior under similar sort of circumstances. All right, now we're moving on to the applications of the proposed precedential account of minimal agency. First to the social sphere and then to large language models. So let me begin with the social sphere. Ronald Dworkin, who's not normally thought of as a social ontologist, thinks that the law, right, the legal system is an agent on precisely these grounds. And again, he didn't, right, kind of spend a lot of time working out the precedential account of minimal agency, but he has a strong intuition about the importance of being able to perseverate, to turn an is into an ought. And he uses that to make a claim that, in fact, a political system is a kind of person, right? So Ronald Dworkin's law of integrity stresses the importance of integrity in individuating a legal system. Quote, the history of a social practice defines the communal groups to which we belong and the obligations that attach to these, right? So what we did in the past, right? Maybe a judge more or less randomly made a judgment, but all of a sudden that judgment can come to take on the weight of precedent. It becomes our own, right? In a common law system. Right. And the extraordinary thing about Dworkin is he takes this, right, this appeal to tradition as a mark that the law is a natural system or a minimal agent, right? So, quote, my account of political integrity takes personification seriously, as if a moral community really were some special kind of entity distinct from the actual people who are its citizens. Worse, it attributes moral agency and responsibility to this distinct entity. I think he might go a little too far right there, but that's all right. For when I speak of a community being faithful to its own principles, and really he means its own history, I mean that the community has its own principles, itself can honor or dishonor, that it can act in good or bad faith with integrity or hypocritically, just as people can, okay? So not every institution would qualify as a minimal agent, but those institutions, right, which take seriously their own history of response, if Dworkin is right, and if the precedential account of minimal agency is correct, might qualify as minimal agents, okay? So even maybe a for-profit corporation, depending on how deep the corporate culture is, perhaps could qualify as a minimal agent on these grounds. If it doesn't, right, if it's just trying to maximize shareholder value, then it's not a minimal agent, it's a rational organization, it's a tool. Finally, are LLMs agents on the precedential account, okay? Large language models are deep neural networks that attempt to produce a reasonable continuation of an input sequence of tokens. Probably don't need to say that to anyone here. Before I try to answer this question using the precedential account to decide whether or not some LLMs might qualify as minimal agents, let me just distinguish the use context or the context of use from the context of training. Most of our interactions with LLMs are in the context of use, right? We ask it questions and it gives us feedback. That's very good. For example, if you want to try to figure out whether or not it passes the Turing test, but I'm actually not that interested in the context of use, right? Because I regard the context of use as the frozen precipitant of a more dynamic learning process, right? And at the heart of the precedential account is a learning process, which I think uniquely characterizes or potentially uniquely characterizes minimal agents, right? So really, I want to focus on the training context, where LLMs use a massive training set to generate and continuously update a probabilistic model of what a subsequent token would be given an input sequence, right? And so it's this dynamic thing. It's constantly changing as, you know, it makes a random walk in light of errors and failures to predict the mass token. So focusing on the training context, are LLMs minimal agents on the precedential account? Initially, it seems like they are, right? That like E. coli, they do seem to perseverate on what would seem to be initially random responses in exactly the way that the precedential account would require. All right, so I'm going to argue seemingly yes, but in the end, I'm going to argue no. In fact, they don't qualify as agents. So seemingly yes, okay? I won't go into the training process, except to say that the training process right, is a sort of Darwinian environment, right? Initially, an LLM will, given a series of tokens that it has access to, use those as a basis to make a prediction about what the mass token is. The first time it does this, it's almost certainly wrong. It's almost certainly incorrect. And then a selection process sort of comes in and says, no, try again. And it updates its weights in order to reduce the loss in subsequent iterations of guessing. Okay, good, right? Even when it fails, right, it would reproduce those responses when confronted with a similar input sequence, right? So it does something initially randomly, and then then it can perseverate on those random responses. However, natural selection comes in and slowly guides the LLM so that it only perseverates on responses that correctly guess a masked token. So in this way, it does seem like the LLM would qualify as a minimal agent if we looked at the training routine, because it perseverates on initially stochastic responses and then is additionally subject to something like a natural selection based on its ability to guess what's behind the mask. So having made the case that LLMs satisfy the conditions of minimal agency, I now want to argue that there's reasons to conclude that LLMs are not really agents, but rather simulations of agency. And this goes back to propriety. So by perseverating on an initially stochastic policy for token prediction, the LLM makes its policy its own, right? It turns the is of a random response into a kind of ought or norm. It exemplarizes its own random response, which allows it to perseverate in similar situations. They have the same response in similar situations in the future. But there's at least one policy that the LLM didn't make its own. And that's the policy where it came to value token prediction in the first place. Okay, that was imposed on the LLM by its creators, right? Insofar that this is a key directive, the imperative of token prediction, it's a constraint that's imposed on the system from without, and the system remains more or less akin to a tool than an agent, right? And this is an idea that I have seen echoed by Parisa Savi, quote, in talking about LLMs, these acquired goals are derivative. Their status as goals ultimately depends on us. So regardless of the machine's degree of independence from our knowledge or causal influence in acquiring them, they do not make a difference to whether it has a good of its own, okay? So at its root, right, because we in some sense impose this goal on the LLM, the goal of token prediction, otherwise satisfying the conditions of the precedential account of minimal agency, I think that it doesn't. That's not to say that I think that it couldn't. And this is the last thing I have to say. We can imagine, right, we put the LLM in a world of tokens, and maybe it just starts doing things, right? Maybe one just randomly starts counting the number of Fs, right, or something like that, and then perseverates on that. And if one of these things then starts randomly kind of guessing masked tokens, right, and then perseverates on that goal, maybe, right, maybe that LLM would qualify as a natural agent on the present account. But it has to be sourced in some ways in its own choices. So with that said, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Yeah, I mean, I had a few different questions, but maybe I could start with one and I can put myself back in the line later. So one thing I myself thought about in relation to agency and LLMs is this kind of strange view where there's a sort of agency there, but there's no agent, so to speak. So when you're using the LLM, there's something that sort of resembles agency, and it can maybe be interpreted as a kind of agential response, but doesn't seem to be a clear candidate for who or what the agent would be. So are you assuming, I mean, I guess that's the normal thing to assume, that agency will require an agent, or could there be sort of free-floating agency in this strange view that I'm sometimes thinking about? I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but
it does, and thanks for that. It's not a distinction that I until you brought it up that I thought to make, right? So I'll have to think more about it. I'm teaching a Buddhist philosophy class right now, you know, when I think, okay, what do you need to add to agency to get an agent? You know, and maybe it's just that Buddhist philosophy class. I think about agency in pretty minimal terms. Agents in pretty minimal terms anyway, right? There's not any sort of substance behind it. There's not any sort of soul behind it. So if Buddhism is an account of agency, of agents vis-a-vis agency, then and to the extent that I'm sympathetic with that view, I'd be sort of less inclined to draw that distinction, at least not like if you have more to say about what you think the distinction might amount to without falling back into a kind of, I don't know, substance dualism or anything like that, I'd be very open to it. But at least so far, I think I see the two terms as gesturing towards the same set of processes.
Thanks. So I'm a big fan of minimalist accounts in general, but I was a little bit puzzled at the turn at the end. I thought I'd push back in a couple of ways and see what you say. So the main turn at the end where you say no, but actually they don't have minimal agency is that they sort of didn't pick the training objective of prediction loss themselves. So
Yeah,
I would
that's right.
sort of push back from the organism or human case and say, like, I don't recall ever having picked dopaminergic learning or whatever,
Yeah.
as a basic training objective for me.
Yeah.
And another line that I've kind of pushed back on in interpreting what LLMs do is there's this popular idea that because we know their basic learning objective is prediction error loss, that's all they do. And I think that's wrong. It doesn't tell you that they don't develop kind of interim goals or objectives that they use in flexible ways to minimize the prediction error loss. You actually have to do mechanistic interpretability work to see what kinds of internal organization they develop because they're very complex. And you find, for example, they recognize, they at least seem to have information and track stuff that you wouldn't think they would just for prediction error loss, like, communicative intentions and the affective states of the humans they're interacting with. And, that's not even taking into account the fact that, LLMs like GPT-3 and 4 also go through reinforcement learning with human feedback as an additional step after the pre-training. Okay, they also didn't pick the reinforcement learning from human feedback objective, but that gives them another source of kind of self-exploring how they're going to reduce all of these different training objectives. So the thought would be like, maybe be a little bit more optimistic, at least until the mechanistic interpretability work pans out a little bit more.
Good. Thanks for that, Cameron. So you're exactly right. Right. When it comes to our own developmental history, right, we didn't build from ground zero. Here, it seems like we were given, right, we're born with a number of imperatives that can't be traced back, to this generate and test mechanism. And I think my response to that is to agree with that claim. Absolutely agree with that claim. But right, to maybe extend the bounds of agency in a way that allows us to go back throughout our to extend back throughout our phylogenetic history, right? So I inherited something like a series of imperatives, from my evolutionary ancestors. And if you go back far enough, you do find something like this process, this generate and test process in our deep evolutionary history. And in fact, many of our instincts or many of our behaviors are just the frozen precipitants of what was eventually, or what was in the past, a process that resembled this, right? But it doesn't seem like you get the same sort of evolutionary historical continuity when it comes to LLMs, right? That really was, I mean, maybe, right? But that really was, right? Like researchers just saying, look, like your job is to predict mass tokens, right?
I mean, if you go into the engineering history, you'll find they tried all kinds of things and everybody was kind of iteratively building on what some other research group did. But
yeah. But that still might be different than the case sort of where I imagined, right? Where we sort of just, right, allow a system on its own, right, kind of let it loose in a world of tokens and have it do a bunch of different things, right? And maybe it would come up with its own with the task of token prediction. So that's us doing a generate and test process, but I'm not sure that's properly attributed to the LLM. Now, as far as your second point, you're exactly right. I'm focusing on a very narrow part of an extremely complicated process, namely this unsupervised learning component. Insofar as that only captures a part of what is involved in the creation of an LLM. then you know, that's just right. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm not talking about LLMs, but just a part of the training process.
So I think there's a paper by, well, just John here, John Simmons. Yeah. Yeah. So him and I wrote a paper. I think you might find helpful on minimal agency. We kind of make similar distinctions, or as you are trying to. And another one I think is also by John and some Paco Calvo, where they talk about minimal cognition, and where they mention, well, they talk about how every organism, even minimal cellular organism, have this, internal capacity to maintain equilibrium. So that could be helpful for your paper.
Cameron asked basically the question that I was going to ask, only better. But so maybe I'll follow up on that a little bit. It sounds like, based on your response to him, that whether something is an agent or a minimal agent is not a fact that supervenes on its current structure or capacities, right? So you could have two molecule for molecule identical entities, but if one had a certain type of evolutionary history and the other one didn't, you would have one be an agent and another one not. So that might be kind of unintuitive, but maybe it's also, appealing in a different way. I was just wondering if that's something that you welcome.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is something that I'd welcome, Eric. That I see agents as historical kinds, in precisely this kind of way, in the same way that I see a species as a historical kind, so that a molecule for molecule reproduction of an ant that's not phylogenetically connected that we find on Mars, that's not phylogenetically connected to ants as we normally understand them, would not qualify as the same species, right? So there's a little bit of a process ontology that's animating this conception of agency. And what happens when you freeze frame the world is you lose the processual, or you just see one frame of the processual. So yeah, I'm really sympathetic to the idea that agents are a process, and so historical kinds.
I'm wondering also maybe about a minimal case. So let's say that you have a mountain slope and you've got a bunch of rocks on the top, and the first rock goes down and tumbles down the slope and leaves a little groove.
Yeah.
And because it left that groove, the next rocks are more likely to follow in that groove, right? So you end up with a kind of, would that satisfy the conditions of minimal agency?
It's such a good question. Maybe it's just not right. So yeah, on one level, but maybe it's just right, that capacity is just not systemic enough to satisfy, right? So yeah, that one-off case, it seems to, right, there's a sort of stochastic response that then engenders a similar sort of response in the future. But I think in order to qualify, first, I just haven't thought about that case. It's a wonderful counter example. But I think in order to qualify as an agent, there would have to be a kind of more systemic ability, right, to treat as precedent one's initially stochastic responses to a given environment. But that's not a qualification I had built into the account because I hadn't heard this counterexample.
Hey, Josh. Good to hear again about this paper. So I have the impression, as Cameron and Eric sort of talked about this, making it to your own. So your definition of propriety, you say propriety?
Yeah.
Maybe you have to sort of explain this a little bit more. So
Yeah.
I can easily imagine a case where a normal human being, where we don't have to argue whether he has agency or not, would not have that much alternatives. And so it would be in the same stupid situation as a poor large language model, which is sort of forced by the self-attention mechanism to do what they do.
Yeah.
And then so, but still we could sort of say, even if the human didn't have the alternatives, it did make something what came extrinsic to something intrinsic, and it changed it to a normative thing, and then you have your whole argument with the should. And then maybe you need to say something about why you seem to believe that there must be alternatives before we really can attribute the ability of a system to make something to its own.
Yeah. Say just a
And
little bit more about
before you answer, sorry,
Yeah.
that's very impolite, but before you answer, you can read this essay in this book.
Yeah.
You didn't mention that.
Thanks. And I say just I might not have totally understood your question, right? So alternatives. What role do you see alternatives as playing in my account? This appeal to alternatives. Maybe just try one more time. I'm sorry, I didn't fully understand the question.
I mean, you answered, Cameron,
Yeah.
that the large language model doesn't qualify as a minimal agent in your sense because it didn't make the goals to its own goals. Because
Right.
the human
goal.
sort of
Yeah.
forced the large language model to take the goals.
Yeah.
And I am asking, how do I differ between cases where somebody is really making something to his own goal or where
Yeah.
he is sort of forced? And one possible case is if there are no alternatives.
Yeah.
Then you're taking goals from the extrinsic to your intrinsic, and you can make them your own.
Yeah. So
But
I
then
think I
then you
yeah.
had to put a minimal agency to large language models as well.
Yeah. So what happens to agents, right? If they're externally compelled, right, to build in some sense build a new habit? Is that the question? Right? Is that thereby a marker of agent? Because all of my examples, right, just start from random behavior. The baby reaches left, or the baby reaches right, to the right, and then it exemplifies that, or it turns it into a kind of habit. But you're asking the question about, what's the status of engendered behavior, which seems to be obviously compelled from the outside. Is that still a marker of agency? Does that capture what you're getting at?
No, not really. So my problem is maybe I still not understand what you mean by making something to my own.
Yeah.
And you answered, at least as far as I could understood, Cameron, that the large language model cannot make goals to their own goals because
Yeah.
they are forced to take
Yeah.
those. Even though
Yeah.
they start with some random behavior, they are forced by the self-attention mechanism to sort of align to some mechanisms to develop an anticipation of the most likely next token.
Yeah.
And then please explain to me why you say that this makes the difference, that the large language model is forced to
Yeah.
make the goal to its goal. And
Yeah.
what's the difference between you and me, who seem to have the impression that we freely decide to make some goals to our goals?
Yeah. I mean, what I don't want to do is attribute any sort of like libertarian conception of freedom, right? So I'm trying to come up with a conception of propriety, right, which doesn't make any sort of reference to that kind of possibility, and it's one of the reasons why I see stochastic behavior as an especially promising starting point, right? That a stochastic behavior is it doesn't come from someone else. It's not compelled. It's not chosen either. But it's the kind of thing that can be incorporated into the behavioral repertoire of an organism in a way that at least intuitively seems to permit this transition from something that happens to me to something that's my own. You know, but yeah, I think that's the best I got for you.
So thanks, Josh. This is really interesting. I wanted to ask you to say more about, and maybe you could go back to the slide actually, where
Yeah.
you talk about this ability to transform an is to an ought.
Yeah.
Depending on how you spell out the conditions for what that transformation is, it could be extremely cognitively demanding. That's one way it could be demanding. It could be sort of metaphysically demanding. It could be demanding with regard to all the component capacities an entity would need to be able to do that. And I think it was interesting that you talked about Dworkin in this context, because of course, if the analogy is with Dworkin's picture of what judges do, it looks extremely demanding what this transformation process would look like. And so this is just an invitation to say a little bit more about maybe what the range of ways you have in mind an entity would count as doing that would be.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, of course, about judicial behavior and judicial sensitivity to precedent. And part of what I was trying to do by talking about E. coli and infant behavior was to gesture to what propriety might look like, and gesture to the fact that maybe it's not so cognitively demanding, right? So I'm here you got genetically identical E. coli that are physiologically identical, responding in a variety of different ways to the same stimuli, but importantly, right, they're perseverating on it and they're transmitting those behavioral responses to subsequent generations via epigenetic factors, right? That's really striking to me, and right, exactly exemplifies what it is I want propriety to do, and then maybe the rejoinder is like, if the E. coli can do it, and that's all I'm trying to gesture at, maybe propriety isn't as cognitively demanding as the appeal to the judicial case would suggest, and trying to do a similar thing when it comes to infants, right? It's this behavior, this capacity to perseverate, which seems to be found across the biological sphere. But I think you're also right to push me on this, right? That I don't just talk about perseveration or the capacity of perseverate. When I talk about propriety, I introduce, some pretty loaded terminology here. And maybe this is what you're worried about, right? To transform an is into a kind of personal ought, right? Why not just talk about the mechanics of it? There's certain systems that behave randomly in a given circumstance, and tend to do the same sort of thing when confronted with similar circumstances. Why do I even need to bring the ought into this at all? And part of this is I've been working within the enactivist tradition. Enactivists are perhaps more comfortable than other cognitive scientists talking about the idea of intrinsic normativity, right? So to an enactivist, this isn't a bold thing to say, but to non-enactivists, it might seem that I'm unwarranted in positing the normativity. And it may be that this is a point at which I'm prepared to sort of back away and just say, you know what, fine, we have a certain kind of behavior, processual pattern, and maybe the appeal to intrinsic normativity is one step too far.
So just one thing that might be helpful there is to think about the concept of a normative power associated with agency, and then building into that, a wider range of ways that those normative powers can be exercised. And I would think that would give you the conceptual tool you need, although you would need that extra step that it's got this extreme set of, ways in which it can be expressed that are more or less cognitively demanding. But thanks so much.
All right. Yeah. Well, okay. So I'm gonna be real quick. You think that there's no agency here, no agent? What about intelligence? And I'm asking just because so Florida has this view that LLMs, for example, and other AI agents are agents, but not intelligent agents. They're sort of agents without intelligence.
Yeah.
And then you have someone like Stuart Russell would say that yes, there's agency and intelligence here. So I'm wondering if you would have the kind of view that there's intelligence but no agency, or do you have the view that it's neither a form of intelligence nor a form of agency? Just to think about how your view maps onto the space of possibilities.
Good. Thank you for that question. One of the reasons I like talking about agency is I don't have to talk about things like consciousness. Agency strikes me as hard. Consciousness is obviously just baffling. But you know, it still raises the question, right? So is an agent conscious or not? I just don't know, right? And I'd rather not take a stand on that question. But isn't even a minimal agent intelligent? And here I almost want to just gesture towards, you know, Dennett's hierarchy of creatures. A minimal agent is competent. A full-blown, you know, Gregorian creature is intelligent, and it may just require, you know, if we want to ask, is a minimal agent intelligent? I just worry that either we're going to end up stipulating a definition of intelligence, right, simply to answer the question, or if we don't stipulate it, if there's a kind of well-defined conception of intelligence, then that just ends up being sort of something that we can figure out given the proposed account. So I sidestepped it a little bit there, but let me just minimally say that I do think a minimal agent is a competent agent, and whether that's tantamount to intelligence, I don't know.